idea of the paper was something I came up as actually the first time I spoke about this idea was in Rutgers, actually in November 2019 in New Jersey. And it's about how we can look at, evaluate what we call NHS performance and how to see the relationship between the cost of these kind of units and the performance. So the paper here, for those who don't know about the UK, so the title here is about accountability, drivers of accidents and emergency departments. So we looked at the A&E departments across the UK, waiting time performance, and it was an analytical approach for UK National Health Services big data. So as I mentioned, the paper is having myself, Terry, and Hans. We worked on this paper together, and this is like a very first draft for the paper, and we hope to finalize it at some point during the next few weeks. So for those who don't know the NHS is one of the iconic institutions in the UK. It's been initiated on the 5th of July, 1948 by Churchill. And the whole idea is to provide high quality service to all British citizens or anyone who's resident in the UK for free. And it was one of the great ideas that the UK started to look at different aspects and different services across the whole society. However, you can see how it's important. So one of the things, NHS is very sensitive topic for all British people. So even when there was a campaign to promote the Leave campaign out of the EU, NHS was used heavily. So you can see how it's important for British citizens that if you'd like to convince them with anything, you can tie to the NHS and tell them what the benefit to the NHS. So NHS is top priority to the British citizens. So here's something I thought introducing first what the NHS is, called the National Health Service, how it's important in the UK. So looking at, we looked at the problem. The problem is coming from something very, we call it inconsistent, that over the years, NHS started to grow its own budget. So as you can see here, there's a growing budget every year and year in NHS. So there's a lot of investment in this sector of public services across the country. However, the interesting thing that performance is declining. So you can see it's an inconsistent picture here, that you increase the funds to the NHS, however, the performance is declining. So there's something going wrong. And the other thing we looked at here, that when we're discussing this idea, we thought, okay, so this picture we're seeing now, it means that money is not the only solution to get high performance. So there might be other things we need to look at. So we looked at cost as one dimension of this paper. However, we look at other dimensions related to the paper in relation to some other performance indicators, which I'll talk about them later when I'm speaking about the framework. So it was very strange picture to see that you're increasing funding, you're putting more money, but the performance is declining rather than increasing. And here I'm just make sure we're not generalizing. We're here focusing on the A&E, accidents and emergencies. I know in the US we call it ER. So it's the equivalent of ER in the UK. So the accident and emergency performance is declining while we're increasing the funds to these departments. So we need to investigate, first of all, what are the reasons for that and how to ensure that this performance is getting back to acceptable level of performance. So how we measure the performance, or how A&E measure its performance. Normally, the measure or the proxy that the health services in the UK looking at is they're willing to have everyone, or at least 95% of patients coming to the accidents and emergency unit to be seen within 4 hours. So 4 hours is the benchmark. So the idea that a minimum of 95% of everyone coming to A&E must be seen within the 4 hours. Okay, so that's the idea. And as you can see from the figure, we were really hitting the target in 2015, 2016. 2016, 17, we've seen some kind of a decline in this kind of performance indicator, and then some disturbance, but still we are below the target, which is 95%. So there are a lot of things need to be done to get back to the target or even exceed it. So that's the idea here. So that's a confirmation to the picture we've seen before, that there is an issue with the performance at the moment. So we need to ensure that we reach back the target, which is 95% of patients to be seen within the first 4 hours from the time they reach A&E or accidents and emergencies. So the NHS came up with something called the long-term plan, which is one of the things is that to reduce the emergency hospital services pressure. A&E is always busy. And if you're living in the UK, you can know that. And actually, it's one of the departments in every hospital, which is under extreme pressure every day. And actually, when we were doing this paper, every one of us was speaking about his own experience of going to A&E by a way or another. And everyone was having this kind of experience, either through himself, his family members, or even friends. So everyone can tell a story about A&E in the UK. So the UK system, or the NHS long-term plan, trying to do something called boosting out-of-hospital care. So trying to ensure that they reduce the number of patients coming to A&E units. So they do outpatient hospital. They do something called same-day emergency care, which is again is an ambulance emergency care. It's like a mobile A&E, and all of that to reduce number of people coming to A&E. And here, the government was just following one reason, saying that we think that A&E is not performing well because of the number of patients coming to A&E. And I think that might be one of the reasons, but we've done some research, we found other reasons why A&E is not performing up to the level the government would like to see their performance or their achievement. However, the number of A&E patients successfully treated within 4 hours is 100,000 per month in 2019, which is higher than 5 years ago. There is a light at the end of the tunnel here, that there is some progress has been done, but we still didn't hit the 95% threshold yet. So by expanding, reforming urgent and emergency care and services, we thought that A&E need to relieve this pressure. And of course, when you come to the winter, you have these winter demand spikes coming as well. Of course, this research is not taking consideration COVID-19. So the timeline we used for this data we collected is not including COVID-19. And of course, if you, without any further discussion, you can tell if the A&E departments are struggling at the moment at this time. Imagine we're having COVID-19 as well. So if you go to the new figures, and we've got some updated figures, they're very, very low. They're below 93%. I think the latest figure I've seen recently is about 60 to 70% of patients being seen in the first 4 hours because, of course, COVID-19 is putting more pressure. Okay. All right. So one of the things we're trying to do here is to look at a model and how we're going to get this model to work. So one of the things we're trying to achieve in this case is to look at the framework. And ask ourselves a very simple question. What are the accountability drivers for this kind of performance? So we thought that there are 5 drivers. One of them is the cost. Definitely, we call them the cost drivers, where we looked at something called the cost currency. And of course, my colleagues will speak more about that. Something else which is related to the patient's characteristics. And the patient's characteristics here are, we looked at the age of the patients coming to A&E, we looked at the gender, the time of arrival, and the time of arrival here, we looked at the days, which day they arrive, what time they arrive, and the method of arrival. Are they coming with using their own transportation? Are they coming on foot? Are they coming with the helicopters or ambulance, or any other way of arriving? And then we looked at staff composition in these A&E units. So we looked at the 4 categories. There's doctors, consultants, nurses, and carers. And finally, we looked at the quality assurance to the data. That's including mainly 5 dimensions, include the cost, the activity, the sense check they done, benchmarking, and the data quality for these kind of units. So this is simply the framework we're looking at. So we looked at the 4 areas here affecting A&E performance, measured by patients seen in the first 4 hours, and we use that as a percentage. So I now hand over to my colleague Hans, who will take us through the methodology of this paper. So Hans, are you in?
I am in and on. as well.
Well,
Thank you very much, Amir, and good afternoon, everybody, and good morning. So I'm just going to talk you through the collection of the data sets. That was actually not completely trivial. We used 3 data sets. The first one is a cost data set. So all the A&E departments in the UK actually log and record their costs and also the number of patients that the costs refer to. So that's one. And they actually have that as a completed data set for the first time 1819, and that's also exactly the year that we're looking at. So that's one. We then have a performance data set, which is also publicly available. So that cost data set is publicly available, and the performance data set is also publicly available, and they have nothing in common. The only thing that they have in common is their ID, the ID of the hospital, which is actually enough to merge them together. So that's what we did. And then we also have a quality assurance survey, and that is actually a survey where the hospital lists some of its transparency measures. Have I got that right, Amir?
yeah, that's right. This is normally when each hospital submits its reports every year.
Yeah,
So they need to fill a survey to fulfill these kind to ensure that this data is reliable and is being collected
yeah.
in a timely manner.
So it's basically a survey where they say to what extent all that data is actually assured. So how certain they are that that data is correct. So we use that as well in the research. So next slide, please. Yeah, so this is the cost data set. So we take that from that particular website, and that's a huge data set full of text. It's a CSV file. And there's 2 versions of it. One is a sort of regular version, and the other one is called market forces factor version, adjusted, which basically tries to ensure that you can compare all the data, both north in the country and south in the country, et cetera, et cetera. So they adjust that, for example, by land building costs and by local tax rates. So just to make sure you can really compare all those costs like for like. So we use that particular data. The next one is the performance data that we take that from a completely different website, also from the NHS. And that's again a huge data set from that particular website. And that gives you the performance data, including that 4-hour metric, which is so important for the hospitals. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so this is an example of that cost data set. And we're going to focus on the currency. So what you see here, every row is a hospital. And every hospital, no, not every hospital, but most hospitals have an accident and emergency department. You can see that here. And we're looking in particular at the currency codes. Now, currency has got nothing to do with monetary currency in this case, but it's basically the way that the NHS describes its processes. So here we have VBO4Z, VBO3Z, VBO2Z, et cetera, and those are just codes for processes. I'll talk about that in the next slide, I think. We also have the number of patients there, so you can see that, and then that's the total cost. So you can also calculate the unit cost later on. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so all these costs are coded in 2 ways, in outcomes and in processes. We're not actually going to look a lot at these outcomes, so I suggest we just skip this particular slide and move on in the interest of time. But we're going to look at this one. So here, what the hospitals do is they code whatever happens to a patient. And so they say, okay, that's well, let's just look at the last one. That's not so nice. That is dead on arrival. And then you basically move on to VB11, which basically means, well, we've looked at you, but there's nothing wrong with you, so go away. And then there's dental care. And then you have the different categories of investigation and the different categories of treatment, as you can see. And then the top one is VB017, and that's any investigation of category 5 treatment. And that, as you can imagine, that's a super intensive treatment. So those are the currencies, the codes that we have. So we have basically average unit costs for each of these processes. So we can see which one is the most expensive, basically, or which one leads to the better performance. Okay, let's move on. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is the performance data set. So again, you've got that code. So that code is basically a 3-letter digit that identifies the hospital. And then we have quite detailed information about waiting times. So you can see here, for example, the number of patients that left within 10 minutes, and the number of patients that left within 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and so on. But what the NHS do is they calculate, as Amir was already saying, they calculate that percentage of attendance that left within 4 hours. And that's a key metric. And most people in the UK know about that metric. And that's a very important one. Yeah, so let's move on to the next one. So then we have to merge those two data sets. I won't go into too much detail about it, but it is, as I said, that is not particularly trivial. But what you would ideally like is you would like all the units in rows, and you would then have all the average unit costs for every service and for every currency in columns. And then you have the other properties of the A&E unit, for example, number of doctors, number of nurses, etc. And then finally, at the end, the waiting time performance. So that's your dependent variable, if you like. And if you've got the data set in this format, you can put it into Stata and all the rest of it. But it was quite tricky to get it actually in this particular state. So next slide, please. Yeah, so the way we did that was using Python. So I'm just going to show you a particular piece of code that we used to take that data and just, bring it all, transpose it, and use the average costs. We can move on because I won't go through that. You can go on, Amir. So just by way of example, you see here the first row, that is that process that I was talking about. So the A&E unit, they code their activity as that particular currency. You can see here that for that Manchester University NHS Foundation Trust, so that's basically the A&E department in Manchester, Manchester Central. So 1915 patients had no investigation and no significant treatment, and that cost them £180,503. Okay, and they were admitted. So there's a difference between admitted and not admitted. So Manchester is a type 1 A&E. But what you do is you add them together. That's the next step, I think. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so you add them together and you add also the cost together, and then you calculate the average unit cost. So that's £74 for each patient. That makes sense. And you do the same for the other activity and the other activity and so on. So that's how we calculate the average unit cost for every process. So next slide. Yeah, so then we transpose the columns and we merge it with the rest of the data. So that's basically when you get the final data sets ready for analysis, and you can start analyzing which of these activities has an impact on performance. So next slide. Yeah, and then hooray, we're here. So we've got all that done, and we can put it into Stata. Okay. Do you want to say something about the quality assurance survey, Amir?
Not really. I mean, those are the 5 dimensions. Simply, we got it from a survey, which is a different data. We got it from something called the general file for each hospital. And again, we merged it with the data Hans was just speaking about together in one sheet. Again, they were being scored. So they are all qualitative data. So we transfer that into scores to add it to the data to make sure the data is consistent.
Yeah. Okay, next slide. Okay, I think that's my part done.
All right. So Terry, you'd like
Thank
to
you, Hans.
take us through the results?
Sure, no problem. All right, thank you, Hans. Thank you, Amir. Good day, everyone. All right, so I'm going to take you through the results. So next, I'm just going to take you through the results from our analysis. But first, we're going to take a look at some descriptive statistics for the data that Hans would have been able to process and provide to us. So again, we have performance, which for the purposes of this piece of work, it's percentage attendance within 4 hours. So we want it to be the case. While the NHS would like it to be the case that the lion's share of patients are seen within 4 hours. Remember, Amir said up front that the target is around 95%. We see a mean here of around 85%. So we're not actually meeting the target across the NHS. Then we have some descriptive statistics for the various costs that Hans would have just spoken about. So we have VB1, VB2, and so on. And here we have relative measures of these costs. So the mean here should be interpreted as the relative proportion of VB1 as a proportion of total costs. So VB1 costs, which entails costs associated with emergency medicine, any investigation in category 5 treatments that you would appreciate. This is the most severe type of treatment. This represents the lion's share of the costs. Then we have VB2, essentially 15% of the costs, VB3, and so on. So these are the costs and performance data. Next slide, please. And here we have descriptive statistics as it relates to patient categories. So we have various demographic information concerning our patient, or the patients that are seen. So we have whether they're male, female, whether they arrive during working hours, where we define working hours as the hours, the period between 9 and 5 p.m., 9 a.m., 5 p.m., non-working hours. We have their age set up, placed into different buckets, so between 0 and 9 years old, between 10 and 19, and so on. Whether they arrive on weekends or not, whether they arrive by ambulance or helicopter, some other form of arrival, or whether the arrival is unknown, right? So again, these are relative proportions. So we have the proportion of patients who are male, 49%, female, 51%, 60% of patients arrive during working hours, and so on. Next slide, please. Here we have the descriptive statistics as it pertains to staff composition in the NHS trusts. So we have the doctors, consultants, nurses, and care providers, the proportions of the staff mix as it relates to the various A&E departments. So we see that 16% of staff tend to be doctors, 7% consultants, 50% nurses, and so on, care providers. Next. And finally, as it relates to the descriptive statistics, we have we've collected information from the quality assurance survey. We have various items here that the hospital, or the A&E department, the hospital as a whole is meant to respond to these items as it relates to the transparency and so on, and the quality of the data that they're providing. So these are just the quality assurance items and the descriptive statistics as it pertain to them. Next slide. Right, so in this piece, we're trying to assess the relationship, of course, between the percentage attendance within 4 hours, that should be hours and not years, within 4 hours, and the various drivers of accountability within the NHS trust, right? So we're regressing percentage attendance within 4 hours on a constant and our various drivers of accountability within the NHS trust. And so the first model we have here, the percentage attendance within 4 hours on a constant, the A&E cost drivers, plus a control for the number of patients seen by the hospitals. Then we have percentage of patients dealt with within 4 hours, patient characteristics, so things like sex, age, and so on, as our principal accountability driver here in model number 2, plus a control for the number of patients seen. Model number 3, the same thing as before, but we're regressing in this case percentage attendance within 4 hours on constant, the staff composition, and finally the percentage attendance within 4 hours on the constant and the quality assurance responses that were captured in the survey. For each of the models, we include variants that include and exclude controls for fixed effects due to region and due to the organizational type. So of course, the NHS trusts are in different parts of the country, so we include controls for different regions of England, and we also of England, and we also include controls for the type of institution, whether the institution is an acute care institution or not. All right, so these are some of the results. For the first model, where we are regressing again our measure of performance, percentage attendance within 4 hours on the various cost drivers, so the VBs essentially. And the interesting result that we find here is that there is a positive relationship between VB3 across all of our models. So, like I said, we have various specifications where we include controls for total number of patients seen, where we include controls for region and organizational type fixed effects, where we include and exclude controls for these things. So we have 8 models that are essentially speaking to empirical model number 1, assessing the relationship between trust performance in terms of percentage attendance within 4 hours and costs and the various cost drivers. And we notice here that within time performance is positively related to VB3, right? This is costs associated with emergency medicine, category 3 investigation, and category 4 treatment, right? So this is a very interesting result. Also very interestingly, we do not find that the costs is driving, we don't find that all the other costs have any relationship between, there's no relationship between them and performance, which is consistent with what Amir would have spoken to before. There's an increase in the resourcing budgets, but the quality tends not to be, in terms of the percentage attendance within 4 hours tends not to be improving. Clearly the relationship can't be negative, right? We wouldn't expect an increase in resourcing of the A&E department to result in a reduction in costs. We would expect the opposite, but we see actually no effect for the most part. Next slide. So next, with regards to model 2, we're regressing accident and emergency waiting times, the percentage of patients attended to within 4 hours. We're regressing that on patient characteristics, so whether the patient's male, female, whether they arrived during working hours or not, their age, and so on. And here we find a negative relationship between performance and the proportion of patients who are females. This suggests that those NHS trusts that deal with, that have more females in their patient mix tend to have poor performance in terms of percentage attendance within 4 hours. This finding is actually quite interesting because it suggests that if with a greater degree of females in your patient mix, perhaps these NHS trusts that deal with more females should be better resourced in order to ensure some equity in waiting times, and maybe should be better resourced in order to reduce waiting times. So this is an interesting result. We find also a negative relationship between percentage attendance within 4 hours and the age group between 50 and 59, again suggesting that those NHS trusts that deal with this particular group as a greater proportion of their patient mix, maybe should be better resourced in order to reduce percentage waiting times, in order to ensure equity across NHS service in England. We also find that arrival via ambulance and helicopter also has a negative impact on waiting times, suggesting that those institutions that deal with more, that have more, that receive their patients more so via ambulance and helicopter, waiting times are diminished as a result. Perhaps because when the ambulance or the helicopter comes in, that patient has to jump the queue and the other patients are required to wait even longer. We do find that those NHS trusts which receive, we do find a positive relationship between some other form of arrival, so maybe by a personal vehicle and so on, and percentage waiting times across the piece. So this is a fairly interesting result. We think those NHS trusts that deal with a higher proportion of females, maybe they should be better resourced. Those NHS trusts that that deal with individuals between say 50 and 59 or individuals over 50, maybe they should be better resourced in order to reduce waiting times. Next slide, please. We also find in very striking form here and very strong results that suggest that the percentage of consultants in the staff mix has a positive impact on performance. So more consultants as a proportion of staff, as composition of staff, has a positive impact on the likelihood that patients will be seen within 4 hours. And this is a very, very striking result. It's very strong. And it does suggest that another avenue that the NHS could look at to reduce waiting times might be to increase the proportion of consultants in the staff mix. And we find this across all of our models. Next slide. Unfortunately, we don't find any significant results with respect to the relationship between the percentage attendance within 4 hours and our quality assurance survey responses. So there are no interesting results to present there. So we don't find any significant results there. Next slide, please. All right, so in conclusion, in this paper explores the relationship between accident emergency waiting time performance and various accountability drivers, right? So remember, these accountability drivers are A&E cost drivers, patient characteristics, A&E staff composition, and responses to the quality assurance survey. So these are the main cost drivers that we're looking at and seeing how these impact the main accountability drivers that we're looking at, and we're trying to see how these impact upon the performance as indicated by percentage of patients that are attended to within 4 hours. Concerning the A&E cost drivers, we find that waiting time performance is positively related to DB3, which is the cost associated with emergency medicine category 3 investigations and category 4 treatment. As it relates to patient characteristics, we find that waiting time performance is negatively related to the proportion of patients who are females. This suggests that maybe in order to ensure equity across the piece, and also in order to reduce the waiting times of NHS trusts, perhaps when these institutions have a higher degree of females in their patient mix, they should be better resourced to better deal with them and to reduce waiting times across the board. Also, we find that for the age group between 50 and 59, this group also has a negative impact on waiting time performance, and perhaps institutions that deal with predominantly this group or a disproportionate number of individuals between this age range should be better resourced. We also find the very interesting results that the great proportion of consultants in the staff composition has a positive impact on waiting time performance, and this is something that the NHS and the government could look at in order to help reduce waiting times across the piece. We don't find we find no significant results for the quality of assurance survey responses. Thank you.